The Galactic University's Advanced Xenobiology Wing hummed with the kind of barely contained energy that suggested someone, somewhere, was about to make a spectacularly poor decision. And today, that someone was Dr. Corvash, a 6-foot-tall mantis-like creature whose compound eyes gleamed with the sort of academic enthusiasm that had probably gotten him banned from at least 3 star systems. "Today, my dear students," he clicked in his translator-filtered voice, mandibles twitching with barely suppressed glee, "we conduct what I like to call a practical fear response assessment." The way he said it made it sound like he was announcing a surprise birthday party. If birthday parties typically involved psychological trauma and potential therapy bills, the lecture hall fell silent. Well, as silent as a room full of various alien species could manage. There was still the gentle hissing of the serpentine student in row 3, the occasional chittering from the insectoid delegation near the windows, and what sounded suspiciously like someone quietly praying to their respective deity in the back corner. Gemma Blake, the sole human in Advanced Xenobiology 401, looked up from her notebook where she'd been sketching what appeared to be a detailed diagram of some kind of flower, or possibly a weapon. With humans, one could never be entirely certain, and that uncertainty was precisely what made the other students shift uncomfortably whenever she entered a room. She was, by most standards, completely unremarkable. Average height for a human, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the sort of clothing that suggested she'd gotten dressed in the dark and couldn't be bothered to care. Her only distinguishing feature was a small scar along her left temple that she'd never bothered to have removed, despite the university's excellent medical facilities. What made her remarkable wasn't what you could see. It was what you couldn't. "Professor," ventured Klex, a crystalline being whose voice sounded like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. "When you say fear response assessment, are we talking theoretical analysis, or—" He paused, his translucent form flickering nervously. "Please tell me we're talking theoretical." Dr. Corvash's laugh was the sound of grinding metal filtered through a garbage disposal. "Oh, my dear student, where would be the educational value in that? No, no, no. Today we have a very special guest joining us. Something to really test those fight-or-flight reflexes you've all been reading about." A ripple of unease swept through the classroom like a Mexican wave of pure anxiety. The serpentine students' hissing increased in pitch and frequency. Someone in the back actually whimpered. Gemma continued sketching, occasionally pausing to chew on the end of her stylus, in a way that made several nearby students flinch. She wasn't being deliberately intimidating. She was just existing. And somehow, that was worse. "Now, before we begin," Dr. Corvash continued, clearly enjoying himself immensely, "I want you all to remember that this is a controlled environment. The specimen has been properly contained, and university safety protocols are in full effect." He paused for dramatic emphasis, which was probably where he should have stopped talking. But Dr. Corvash, like many academics, had never met a dramatic pause he couldn't improve with additional ominous commentary. "Of course," he added, with what could generously be called a smile, "these particular safety protocols have never been tested on a creature of this caliber." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Or maybe that was just everyone's blood pressure plummeting simultaneously. "What exactly are we dealing with here, Professor?" This came from Thane, a bipedal reptilian whose scales had shifted from their usual emerald green to a distinctly nervous shade of yellow. As a member of a species that had evolved from apex predators, Thane wasn't accustomed to feeling like prey. He didn't like it. Ah, excellent question. Dr. Corvash rubbed his forelimbs together in a gesture that probably looked scholarly to him, but came across as deeply sinister to everyone else. Our guest today is a specimen from the void sectors, specifically, a creature that feeds on fear itself. The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop. In fact, several students were probably considering dropping pins just to break the tension. It feeds on fear? Klex's crystalline form had gone completely opaque, which was the equivalent of a human turning pale. As in, it literally consumes terror as a food source? Precisely! Isn't that fascinating? Dr. Corvash's enthusiasm was the kind typically reserved for discovering new species or announcing lottery winnings. It's a psycho-emotional predator. The more afraid you are, the stronger it becomes. The university acquired it from a research station that was, well, let's just say, they're no longer in need of it. They're no longer in need of it because they're no longer alive, aren't they? The question came from somewhere in the middle rows, though nobody seemed eager to claim ownership of it. Details, details. Dr. Corvash waved a dismissive appendage. The important thing is that we now have a unique opportunity to observe genuine fear responses across multiple species in a controlled academic setting. Think of the papers we could publish. Gemma finally looked up from her notebook, glancing around the room with mild curiosity. She seemed to be the only person present who wasn't calculating escape routes or composing final messages to loved ones. Instead, she appeared to be wondering what all the fuss was about. This was, several students noted with growing unease, exactly the kind of reaction that made humans so deeply unsettling. Any reasonable person would be terrified. Any sane person would be demanding to know why. The university's insurance even covered this sort of thing. But Gemma Blake just sat there, looking mildly interested in the same way someone might look at a particularly unusual cloud formation. The specimen is being prepared in the containment chamber as we speak, Dr. Corvash continued, either oblivious to or actively ignoring the mounting horror of his students. In a few moments, we'll activate the viewing portal and observe its reaction to our presence. Please, try to maintain academic objectivity. I know it will be challenging once you see it, but remember, we are scientists first. Scientists who are about to voluntarily expose themselves to a creature that eats fear, muttered someone in the back row. Exactly. Isn't science wonderful? Gemma tilted her head slightly, the way someone might when trying to solve a mildly interesting puzzle. Professor, you said it feeds on fear. What happens if someone isn't afraid? The question hung in the air like a particularly ominous thundercloud. Dr. Corvash's compound eyes focused on her with the intensity of someone who had just realized they might have overlooked a crucial variable in their carefully planned experiment. That's a very good question, Miss Blake. I suppose we'll find out. Around the room, the other students were beginning to put together some deeply uncomfortable pieces. They were about to be exposed to a fear-eating monster. The only human in the class had just asked what happens if someone isn't scared, and they all knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty usually reserved for mathematical proofs and impending doom, that humans were famous throughout the galaxy for having the emotional range of a broken calculator when it came to appropriate fear responses. "Oh," whispered Klex, his crystalline form now flickering between transparent and opaque like a broken hologram. "Oh, this is going to go very, very badly." Dr. Corvash, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with academic excitement as he moved toward the control panel that would activate the viewing portal. His mandibles clicked rapidly, in what his species considered a happy gesture, though to everyone else it sounded disturbingly like bones breaking. "Positions, everyone! The demonstration is about to begin." Gemma glanced back down at her notebook, where her sketch now clearly revealed itself to be a detailed technical drawing of what appeared to be a homemade explosive device, or possibly still a flower. With humans, the line between botany and demolitions was surprisingly thin. She clicked her stylus once, a small, innocuous sound that somehow managed to make every other student in the room feel like they should probably start writing their wills. The viewing portal activated with the kind of ominous hum that suggested whoever designed it had watched far too many horror movies and decided to lean into the aesthetic. The reinforced transparasteel barrier, rated to contain Class 5 threats, according to the small placard that nobody really wanted to read too closely, began to clear, revealing the containment chamber beyond. What emerged from the swirling mist wasn't so much a creature as it was a concentrated nightmare that had somehow achieved physical form and decided to major in intimidation with a minor in psychological warfare. The thing stood roughly 9 feet tall, assuming you could call its method of existence standing. It seemed to shift and flow between states of matter, as if it couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be solid, liquid, or pure malevolent energy. Its form suggested something vaguely humanoid, but only in the way that a fever dream might suggest the concept of geometry, technically accurate but fundamentally wrong in ways that made your brain hurt. What passed for its face was a constantly shifting void where features might occasionally coalesce long enough to suggest eyes, or a mouth, or something far worse than either. Tendrils of what looked like living shadow writhed around its form, reaching out to taste the air for the sweet, sweet flavor of terror. And oh, was there terror to taste? The classroom erupted into chaos with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed disaster drill. Klex immediately went full transparent and tried to meld with the wall, which would have been more effective if walls were traditionally made of crystal. The Serpentine students' hissing reached frequencies that probably violated several noise ordinances, while Thane's scales cycled through a rainbow of distress colors so rapidly that he looked like a malfunctioning traffic light. Several students bolted for the exits, only to discover that Dr. Korvash had engaged the classroom's security lockdown. Because apparently, when conducting experiments with fear-eating void monsters, the first rule was to make sure nobody could escape. This was either brilliant academic methodology or a spectacular failure of basic survival instincts. Possibly both. "Magnificent!" Dr. Korvash cackled, his compound eyes reflecting the chaos with undisguised glee. "Look at those fear responses. The physiological data we're collecting is unprecedented." The creature in the containment chamber straightened, its void face turning toward the viewing portal with the predatory focus of a shark scenting blood in the water. The tendrils of shadow extended further, pressing against the transparasteel barrier as waves of pure dread rolled off it like heat from a furnace. It was feeding, and feeding well. Each sob of terror, each whimper of despair, each barely contained scream of primal fear made it larger, more solid, more real. Its form began to stabilize as it gorged itself on the buffet of horror that Dr. Korvash had so thoughtfully provided. The creature's attention swept across the classroom like a searchlight of malevolence, cataloging each source of fear, savoring the unique flavor of terror from each species. Crystalline panic had a different taste than reptilian dread, which was distinct from mammalian horror. It was like a sommelier of suffering, appreciating the subtle notes and complex undertones of each variety of fear. And then its gaze fell on Gemma Blake. She had looked up from her notebook, where she was now sketching what appeared to be a detailed cross-section of some kind of mechanical device, possibly a toaster or possibly a thermonuclear warhead, and was observing the creature with the mild interest of someone watching a slightly unusual bird at a feeder. The creature paused. Its tendrils, which had been reaching hungrily toward the transparistile, suddenly stopped moving. The void that served as its face seemed to focus, as if it was trying to process something that didn't quite make sense. Where was the fear? Every other being in the room was radiating terror like a space heater, but from the human, nothing. Not just an absence of fear, but something else. Something that made the creature's predatory instincts start sending up warning flags like a ship in distress. Gemma tilted her head slightly, studying the creature the way a scholar might examine an interesting fossil. "Huh," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos. "That's actually pretty cool. Is that a natural bioluminescence, or some kind of psychokinetic manifestation?" The creature recoiled as if she'd slapped it. This was not the response it was accustomed to. In its long existence feeding on the fears of countless civilizations, it had encountered many reactions: screaming, fainting, begging, praying, attacking in blind panic, freezing in catatonic terror. These were all familiar, comfortable, nourishing responses. Academic curiosity was not on the menu. "Professor," Gemma continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she had just caused an apex predator to have what appeared to be an existential crisis. "Does it communicate? I'm curious about its cognitive architecture. The way it's processing environmental stimuli suggests a fairly sophisticated neural network, assuming it has neurons in any traditional sense." Dr. Corvash, caught between scientific fascination and a growing sense that his carefully planned demonstration was veering wildly off script, managed to stammer, It does possess advanced intelligence, yes. Though communication has proven challenging." The creature's form began to shift, its solid edges becoming more fluid, more uncertain. The steady flow of fear from the other students was still feeding it, but the human's complete lack of appropriate terror was like a discordant note in what should have been a symphony of horror. It didn't understand what it was sensing from her, but every instinct it possessed was screaming that this small, unremarkable-looking being represented something dangerous. Gemma made a few more notes in her notebook, occasionally glancing up at the creature with the sort of casual interest usually reserved for museum exhibits. "The shadow manipulation is fascinating. Is that how it processes fear? Or is that more of a locomotive adaptation? I'm wondering about the energy conversion efficiency." The creature took a step back from the transparistile barrier. This had never happened before. In its entire existence, spanning the deaths of stars and the birth of galaxies, no prey had ever made it want to retreat. It was a predator, a devourer of terror, a being of pure malevolent hunger. It did not back down from anything, especially not from something as small and apparently defenseless as this human. But something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The human wasn't just unafraid, she was analyzing it, studying it with the clinical detachment of a researcher examining a lab specimen. And worse, there was something else radiating from her. Not fear, not anger, not even curiosity, really, but something that the creature's ancient predatory instincts recognized as the psychic signature of an apex predator. Which was impossible. The creature had fed on the fears of apex predators from 1,000 worlds. It knew what they felt like, and they all shared certain characteristics: confidence, aggression, territorial instincts, and underneath it all, the capacity for fear when confronted with something genuinely threatening. This human had none of that. She had something else entirely, something that made the creature's shadowy form ripple with unease. It was like looking at a still pond and realizing that the stillness wasn't peace. It was the calm before something massive and terrible rose from the depths. "You know," Gemma said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather, "where I grew up, we had something similar. Not as sophisticated, obviously, but the basic predator-prey dynamic was comparable, though ours were more physical in their approach. Less psychological manipulation, more direct dismemberment. The creature's retreat became more pronounced. Several of its shadow tendrils actually withdrew, pulling back from the barrier, as if the transparasteel had suddenly become red-hot. "Where?" Dr. Corvash found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Where exactly did you grow up, Miss Blake?" Gemma glanced up from her notebook with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring, but somehow managed to make everyone in the room feel like they should probably start running. "Oh, just a little human colony. Titan Station, out in the Outer Rim. Nothing special, really." The creature made a sound that its species had never made before, a low, keening whine that might have been distress, or recognition, or the psychic equivalent of someone realizing they had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. Because even a fear-eating void monster from the darkest corners of space had heard whispers about human colony worlds. And those whispers were not the kind that inspired confidence in one's ability to survive the encounter. The creature's keening whine grew louder, more desperate, like the sound of someone realizing they'd accidentally wandered into the wrong neighborhood at the worst possible time. Its shadowy form continued to retreat until it was pressed against the far wall of the containment chamber, as far from Gemma as the reinforced walls would allow. And then it did something that shattered every assumption the students had about apex predators, fear-eating void monsters, and the natural order of the universe. It spoke. "Professor," the creature's voice was like grinding glass mixed with the whisper of dying stars, filtering through the chamber's communication system with a distinctly pleading tone. "I would like to request immediate extraction from this environment." Dr. Corvash's mandibles froze mid-click. "I'm sorry. What?" "Remove me. Now, please." The creature's void face turned toward the viewing portal, but carefully avoided looking directly at Gemma. "This educational demonstration has concluded. I have learned enough." The silence that followed was so profound that you could hear the ambient hum of the station's life support systems, the gentle buzz of the overhead lighting, and what sounded suspiciously like someone's world view crumbling in real time. "You want to leave?" Thane's scales had settled into a confused shade of purple-blue. "You're a fear-eating monster from the void sectors. You don't get scared. You're literally made of scary." The creature's form rippled with what could generously be interpreted as embarrassment. "Your understanding of my species is limited. Yes, we consume fear. Yes, we are apex predators in most environments. But we are not foolish. Survival requires the ability to recognize when one has encountered something higher on the food chain." All eyes turned to Gemma, who had gone back to her sketching and seemed blissfully unaware that she had just been classified as higher on the food chain than a nightmare creature from the darkest reaches of space. "Miss Blake?" Dr. Corvash's voice cracked slightly. "Perhaps you could elaborate on this Titan station you mentioned?" Gemma looked up with the mild surprise of someone who had forgotten that other people didn't share her life experiences. "Oh, it's really not that interesting. Just your standard human frontier colony. We were the first settlement in the Kepler 442 system, so we had to deal with all the usual stuff." "Usual stuff?" Klex had managed to solidify enough to speak, though his crystalline form was still flickering nervously. "You know," Gemma shrugged, "atmospheric processors breaking down every few months, so we'd have to go outside in partial atmosphere to fix them. Radiation storms that would fry most electronics, so we learned to work around them. The local wildlife was a bit aggressive, but nothing too challenging once you figured out their attack patterns." The creature in the containment chamber made a sound that was definitely distress. Attack patterns? Dr. Corvash was beginning to understand why his carefully planned demonstration had gone so spectacularly off the rails. Well, sure, the hexapods were pack hunters, about the size of your average shuttle, with acidic saliva and a tendency to attack in coordinated swarms. The crystal worms were trickier because they could phase through solid matter, but they were vulnerable to sonic disruption. And the shadow stalkers were actually kind of fun once you got used to them. Fun? The word came from several students simultaneously, delivered in tones of profound horror. They were excellent for night training exercises, really kept you on your toes. My parents used to send me out to collect mineral samples from their nesting grounds when I was about 8. Great way to build character and situational awareness. The creature was now making a continuous low wailing sound that the translation systems were having trouble processing. The closest approximation seemed to be, why? Why does this species exist? What cosmic joke thought this was appropriate? "Miss Blake," Dr. Corvash's voice had taken on the careful tone of someone who suspected they were standing next to an unexploded bomb, "when you say your parents sent you into Shadowstalker territory at age 8? "Oh, not unsupervised," Gemma clarified helpfully. "I had my emergency kit, basic trauma supplies, emergency beacon, combat stims, standard kinetic weapon, emergency rations for 3 days, the usual stuff you give kids when they're doing hazard training." "Combat stims?" Thane's voice had gone up an octave. "You gave combat stimulants to children? Well, you can't expect an 8-year-old to have the natural adrenaline response to handle multiple shadow stalkers simultaneously," Gemma explained with the patience of someone discussing basic parenting techniques. "The stims just leveled the playing field until our natural reflexes developed properly." The creature in the containment chamber had begun what could only be described as hyperventilating, if void monsters could be said to breathe at all. Its form was fluctuating wildly between states, as if its very existence was having trouble processing the information it was receiving. "And this was normal?" Klex asked weakly. "For human children?" "On frontier colonies, sure. Core world kids had it easier, obviously. They just had to deal with things like atmospheric recycling failures and occasional pirate raids. But out on the rim, you had to be more self-sufficient." Gemma paused, considering. "Though I suppose we were pretty sheltered compared to the kids on the military outposts. They had to deal with actual warfare training from age 5. Dr. Corvash was frantically taking notes, his academic instincts warring with his growing realization that he might have inadvertently brought a predator into contact with something that made predators rethink their life choices. "Miss Blake," he ventured carefully, "what exactly do humans consider dangerous?" Gemma tilted her head thoughtfully. "Dangerous how? Like immediately lethal, or just generally hazardous?" "Let's start with immediately lethal." "Well, vacuum exposure without a suit is pretty bad. Most toxins above Class 9 will cause problems. Direct exposure to stellar radiation, uncontrolled gravitational anomalies, the usual physics-based threats." She paused. "Oh, and bureaucracy. That stuff will kill you slowly, but it's inevitable." "And generally hazardous?" Honestly, most of the stuff that other species consider completely unsurvivable, we just classify as inconvenient. High radiation? We developed tolerance protocols, toxic atmospheres, breathing apparatus and environmental suits, predatory megafauna, training, and appropriate equipment. The creature in the containment chamber spoke up again, its voice now carrying a distinctly pleading tone. Professor, I am formally requesting extraction. This human's mere existence violates several fundamental laws of nature, and I am experiencing what I believe your species would classify as existential dread. You're afraid of her? Dr. Corvash couldn't quite hide his fascination. Afraid? The creature's form shuddered. Fear is what we eat. Fear is what we understand. This is something else entirely. This is the psychological equivalent of discovering that your food has been hunting you back the entire time, and it's much better at it than you are. Gemma finally looked up from her notebook, glancing toward the containment chamber with mild interest. Oh, you can talk. That's excellent. I was hoping we could have a conversation. I'm really curious about your energy absorption mechanisms. Do you process fear through direct neural interface, or is it more of a psychic field effect? The creature's response was immediate and decisive. It began throwing itself against the far wall of the containment chamber, apparently trying to phase through solid matter in a desperate attempt to escape. I think, Dr. Corvash said slowly, watching his carefully planned demonstration devolve into a textbook example of why you should always thoroughly research all variables before introducing unknown elements into controlled environments. We may need to reconsider our understanding of interspecies threat assessment. Gemma nodded agreeably. That makes sense. Most species seem to have trouble with threat evaluation when it comes to humans. We get that a lot. She glanced around the classroom, noting the way every other student was pressed against the walls as far from her as possible. Though honestly, I never really understood why. We're pretty straightforward once you get to know us. The creature's wailing reached a new pitch of despair. Straightforward, it moaned. They think they're straightforward. A species that gives combat drugs to children and considers void spawn inconvenient thinks they're straightforward. The creature's panic was becoming so intense that the containment field was starting to fluctuate. Emergency lights began flashing as the system struggled to maintain cohesion around a fear-eater that was experiencing more terror than it had consumed in the past century. Professor! The creature's voice cracked like breaking glass. Your containment protocols assume the subject wishes to remain contained. I am actively trying to escape. This changes the fundamental parameters of your security matrix. Dr. Corvash looked down at his control panel, where several warning indicators were indeed flashing red. The system is designed to keep things in, not to keep them in when they're trying to get away from something else that's also inside the perimeter. Exactly. Your safety measures are based on the assumption that the most dangerous thing in this room is me. The creature's void face somehow managed to convey the expression of someone who had just realized they'd brought a knife to a gunfight, except the gunfight was actually a nuclear exchange, and they hadn't even brought a knife. Thane, who had been quietly having his own crisis about the nature of apex predation, managed to find his voice. Miss Blake, when you mention childhood photos, are we talking about normal family pictures, or— Oh, the usual stuff, Gemma replied, pulling out a data pad with the casual air of someone about to share vacation slides. Birthday parties, school events, my first successful hexapod hunt, family camping trips to the radiation wastes, that sort of thing. She swiped to the first image and held it up. The photo showed a gap-toothed 8-year-old Gemma grinning at the camera while standing next to what appeared to be a dead creature roughly the size of a small spacecraft. She was covered in some kind of luminescent blue substance that was probably blood, holding what looked like a mining laser that had been modified for combat use. "That's from my 9th birthday," she explained helpfully. "Dad thought I was ready to take down a juvenile crystal worm solo. It took me about 6 hours, but I managed to corner it in the old mining tunnels and used sonic resonance to disrupt its phase abilities. Then it was just a matter of sustained energy weapon fire until its crystalline structure collapsed." The collective silence that greeted this explanation was broken only by the sound of Klex's crystalline form shattering into component pieces as his species equivalent of fainting kicked in. "You hunted something that could phase through matter," Dr. Corvash said slowly, "when you were 9 years old." "Well, technically I was still 8 when I started the hunt. The birthday party was after I got back." Gemma swiped to the next photo, which showed a family barbecue where the meat being grilled appeared to have far too many teeth and was still smoking with some kind of toxic residue. This was the celebration feast. Mom made her special sauce, the one with the fermented hexapod glands and concentrated sulfuric compounds. I know it looks a bit weird, but it's actually delicious. Once you build up a tolerance to the neurotoxins. The creature in the containment chamber had stopped trying to escape and was now lying in what appeared to be a catatonic heap, occasionally whimpering about inappropriate species development and why doesn't the universe have better quality control? "Neurotoxins," repeated one of the mammalian students weakly. "Just mild ones," Gemma assured them. "Nothing that would cause permanent damage to a human nervous system. Though I suppose other species might have trouble with them. We never really thought about that." Dr. Corvash was scribbling notes frantically, his academic mind struggling to process the implications of a species that casually consumed neurotoxins as condiments. "Miss Blake, is this typical for all human colonies? Or was Titan Station particularly challenging?" "Oh, we were definitely on the rough side," Gemma admitted. "Most human settlements don't have to deal with phase-shifting predators and constant radiation exposure. Core worlds are much more civilized. They only have to worry about things like economic collapse, political warfare, and the occasional criminal syndicate. Those things sound civilized to you." Thane's scales had now shifted to a pattern that his species usually reserved for impending death. "Well, sure. Those are social problems. You can solve them with negotiation, strategic planning, and occasional targeted violence. Much more civilized than just shooting everything until it stops being a problem." Gemma paused thoughtfully. "Though I suppose the targeted violence part might be where other species get confused about our methods." She swiped to another photo, this one showing what appeared to be a class picture from a human school. The children, ranging in age from about 5 to 15, were all carrying various pieces of military-grade equipment and standing in front of what looked like a smoking crater. "This was from survival education class," she explained. "We'd just finished our practical examination on improvised explosives and defensive fortification. I'm in the back row, 3rd from the left. That's my emergency shelter behind us. I used a controlled fusion reaction to clear the building site. Probably a bit overkill, but I wanted to make sure I had good drainage." "You taught children to build nuclear devices?" Dr. Corvash's voice had reached a pitch that was probably only audible to other insects. "Fusion devices," Gemma corrected. "Much cleaner than fission, and the containment requirements are more manageable for field construction. Besides, it was just for emergency situations. It's not like we were building them for fun." The creature in the containment chamber raised its void face slightly. Please tell me the humans don't reproduce rapidly. Oh no, we're actually pretty slow compared to most species, Gemma said brightly. Only 1 or 2 offspring at a time, and they take about 18 years to reach full maturity. Though by age, 12 or so, most of them can handle basic survival scenarios independently. Basic survival scenarios, the creature repeated hollowly. You know, standard stuff. Hostile environment navigation, equipment failure protocols, predator avoidance and elimination, resource procurement in contaminated zones, basic medical trauma response. Gemma counted off on her fingers. Oh, and social interaction skills, obviously. Can't forget those. Social interaction skills, Dr. Corvash echoed, frantically wondering if his insurance covered psychological trauma, resulting from exposure to inappropriately evolved species. And that's when Gemma smiled, a bright, friendly expression that somehow made everyone in the room feel like prey animals who had just realized they were standing in an open field during hunting season. Well, she said cheerfully, I did bring plenty more photos if anyone wants to see what growing up on Titan Station was really like. I've got some great ones from summer camp. The mention of summer camp caused a collective shudder to run through the classroom that was almost seismic in its intensity. Several students made small, desperate sounds that their translation software couldn't quite categorize, settling for expression of existential dread in floating text bubbles. Summer camp? Dr. Corvash's mandibles had locked in what appeared to be a permanent state of horrified fascination. Please tell me human summer camps involve activities like swimming and crafts? Gemma's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Oh yes, we did lots of swimming. The acid lakes on Titan Station were perfect for endurance training. The pH levels really helped build character and resistance to chemical burns. And crafts were my favorite. We learned to make everything from emergency shelters to improvised weapons using only materials we could scavenge from hostile terrain. She pulled up another photo showing a group of children who couldn't have been older than 10, all grinning while standing waist-deep in what appeared to be glowing, viscous liquid. They were holding up various objects that looked suspiciously like military ordnance. This was from Advanced Underwater Survival Week, she explained. The counselors would drop us off in the deep acid pools with minimal equipment, and we had to work our way back to base camp while avoiding the indigenous life forms. Those tentacle things you can see in the background were actually pretty friendly once you figured out how to communicate with them. The friendly tentacle things in the photo appeared to be roughly the size of subway trains and covered in what looked like both teeth and smaller tentacles that also had teeth. How? Whispered Thane, his voice barely audible. Do you communicate with things like that? Controlled violence, Gemma replied matter-of-factly. Most apex predators respect strength and clear boundary establishment. You just have to demonstrate that you're more trouble to eat than you're worth as a meal. Usually only takes a few demonstrations before they decide to leave you alone. The creature in the containment chamber had begun making a sound that the translation system was interpreting as profound regret about all life choices, with occasional variations of why does this species exist and request for cosmic intervention. Miss Blake, Dr. Corvash managed, his scientific mind still struggling to process the implications. You mentioned that you weren't considered particularly tough by human standards. Could you elaborate on that? Gemma shrugged modestly. Well, I'm just from a frontier colony. Kids from the military stations are way tougher. They start combat training practically from birth, and they have to deal with actual warfare scenarios, not just environmental hazards and wildlife. She paused thoughtfully. And the deep space exploration families? Those kids grow up in zero-G environments dealing with cosmic radiation and void exposure as daily routine. Makes our little colony problems look pretty mild by comparison. Mild, the creature repeated from the containment chamber, its voice hollow with despair. She considers phase-shifting predators and acid lake swimming to be mild challenges. Oh, and then there are the kids from the research stations, Gemma continued, warming to her subject. They grow up around experimental technologies and prototype weapons testing. I heard one family raised their children on a station that was developing weaponized black hole manipulation. Can you imagine? Those kids probably think our little radiation storms and carnivorous wildlife were like a vacation. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. Even the ambient station noise seemed muted, as if the universe itself was taking a moment to contemplate the horror of a species that considered weaponized black holes to be an acceptable backdrop for child rearing. Klex, who had managed to pull his crystalline form back together into something resembling coherence, made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. What? What do humans consider challenging? Gemma considered this seriously. Honestly? Bureaucracy is probably the worst. Nothing quite like spending 3 months trying to get a permit to repair your atmospheric processor while breathing recycled air that's slowly killing you. At least with hostile wildlife, you can shoot it. You can't solve everything with violence, Dr. Korvash protested weakly. No, but you can solve a surprising number of things with violence, Gemma replied cheerfully. It's really more about knowing when to apply the appropriate level of force. Most problems are just resource allocation challenges when you get down to it. She pulled out what appeared to be her lunch from her bag, a collection of items that made several students immediately back away. There was something that looked like fruit, but was glowing ominously, a sandwich that appeared to be moving slightly, and a drink that was definitely changing colors. "Anyone want to try some?" she offered. "The fruit is from the volcanic regions near my colony, really high in nutrients and natural stimulants. The sandwich has protein from those hexapods I mentioned, and the drink is a traditional human energy supplement." The creature in the containment chamber took one look at Gemma's lunch and began what could only be described as sobbing. "They eat things that would kill other species as casual snacks," it wailed. "This is not a species. This is a weaponized disaster that achieved sentience." "That's a bit harsh," Gemma said, taking a bite of her glowing fruit with obvious enjoyment. "We're really quite friendly once you get to know us. Most humans are perfectly willing to share resources and knowledge with other species." "Share?" Dr. Korvash asked faintly. "Sure. We love teaching other species about human techniques and technologies, though I suppose some of our methods might need adaptation for different physiology." She paused, considering. "Come to think of it, most species seem to have trouble with our basic survival protocols. Something about excessive lethality and inappropriate risk tolerance. Never really understood those complaints." The creature managed to raise its void face one more time. "Professor, I am formally requesting not just extraction, but also memory modification to remove all knowledge of this encounter. I do not wish to retain the awareness that this species exists." "Now, that's just silly," Gemma said, standing up and walking toward the viewing portal. Several students immediately fled to the opposite side of the room. "We're not that bad. Here, let me show you something that might change your perspective." She reached into her bag and pulled out what appeared to be a small, harmless-looking device. "This is a little project I've been working on for my engineering elective. It's a modified gravitational field manipulator. Nothing fancy. Just something to help with heavy lifting around the colony. Dr. Corvash's compound eyes focused on the device with growing horror. Miss Blake, gravitational manipulation technology is classified as a Class 10 restricted development. The energy requirements alone could— "Oh, this is just a small one," Gemma assured him, activating the device. The gravitational field in the immediate area shifted, causing several loose objects to float gently in the air. "I built it using spare parts from the cafeteria's food processors and some components from my dormitory's waste recycling system. Nothing too complicated." The creature's final words before it completely shut down were barely audible. "They build gravitational weapons from kitchen appliances. We are all going to die." Gemma looked around the now empty classroom. Everyone except Dr. Corvash had somehow managed to evacuate despite the security lockdown, and shrugged. "I guess humans really are hard to understand," she mused, settling back into her seat to finish her lunch. Dr. Corvash stood frozen at his control panel, staring at his notes and realizing that his carefully planned fear response study had instead become a comprehensive lesson in why the rest of the galaxy treated humans with a mixture of fascination and terror. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, he should consider transferring to a nice, safe field of study, like theoretical mathematics or philosophy. Anything that didn't involve direct contact with humans and their charmingly apocalyptic approach to daily life.